Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is the show where I take a look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of Big Finish audio dramas, one episode a day, 7 days a week. And today, on the 9th of November 2019, we're starting to look at the first installment in two trilogies of main-range Doctor Who stories to feature the Season 19 crew. Starting with The Starmen, which is written by Andrew Smith, and was released by Big Finish in, 2016, I think? Or was it 2017? It was fairly recently, actually. This was released in 2017. So only 2 years ago. I think I probably... Well, no, I hadn't actually started the marathon when this was released, because that started in April. But the Starmen, starting with part 1, this is a story by Andrew Smith, and the first episode is, I will be honest, a good start. It's not the absolute best start to a story ever, but it does what it needs to do. It's very much a functional start to the story. It's, the story takes place basically at this, on this planet where there's basically this giant observatory, which is kind of just, it's there, and we're kind of, we arrive just after the, basically just after sort of, light speed travel has been discovered, and there's this ship called the Johannes Kepler, which took a mission to the large, a place called the Large Magellanic Cloud, basically sort of an exploratory mission, and they lost contact. It was a very experimental craft, so they were prepped in case of this, and that's kind of the premise of the story, is that then the ship comes back and doesn't bring contact. Gonna be honest, this is kind of the premise to the basic premise is kind of the premise to the Ambassadors of Death. Now I don't know if we're gonna get anything similar to the Ambassadors of Death here, but that's the vibe I'm getting, and that's okay. There's mainly because that's one of my big issues, is that it's kind of a standard story. This first episode is kind of standard, and it's been done before, so you don't really necessarily know where the story is going, because of that. You just we've kind of already done this, so you need to sell me, Andrew Smith, on why on why this story is one that necessarily needs to be told, when you could have a story, that's different. It's not necessarily the best explanation I can give, but that's kind of where I'm coming from, at least with her story. I will say, a lot of the opening of the story is done in the TARDIS, and Andrew Smith has a lot of fun playing around with the Andrew Smith has a lot of fun playing around with the TARDIS team. The idea is that this comes right after the visitation, so the Doctor has decided that maybe it's time for Adric to learn how to fly the TARDIS, which I think is an interesting decision. It's an interesting decision to have Adric learn how to fly the TARDIS and be the one in charge. It's very interesting, and of course Nyssa and Tegan. So we actually open with some pretty fun action of the TARDIS kind of Adric flying the TARDIS and then crashing, and then surprise, it's a simulation, which is a little bit of a cop-out in my opinion, but I will at least grant them this, that it's that unlike certain cop-outs, it's one where you get the feeling that the the actual ending here and the idea behind it was meant to be, it actually has a purpose of trying to, give us some nice character interactions and sort of have the season 19 TARDIS crew have a little more warmth to each other, because let's be honest, a lot of this, the team in the stories that we've covered so far have just been bickering and being, very much being characters who are almost at each other's throats a lot, and genuinely have some sort of interesting interactions. And then there's a lot here that's very typical of a Peter Davison story. In this first episode, that's very much how Andrew Smith sets it up. He splits up the TARDIS team, they make it here, they're going to this observation just so Adric can kind of learn to understand the math behind it, and I will, which is interesting. It's an interesting story. So they spread out. Tegan and the Doctor go one way to a viewing deck. Adric and Nyssa go to the astronomy area, and there's this idea of there's some nice world building stuff. The signs on this base are all done through pictograms and not through words. It's sort of an interesting sort of evolution of sort of how language has changed throughout history, from words to a more pictographic society, which I think that's genuinely interesting and an interesting sort of idea. And then a lot of this first episode is actually the Johannes Kepler nearly crashing and trying to basically solve that crisis. Without it creates an interesting crisis. It means that the supporting cast don't necessarily get as much development as they usually would, because you're just right in crisis mode and you're trying to figure everything out. It actually does give Andrew Smith a chance to use Adric again pretty well, as he's the one who quote unquote saves the day, by basically doing math in his head to move a telescope to deflect the ship, which is quite clever and quite fun. I will say there's decent stuff to enjoy here. With Adric, Andrew Smith does do a good job of making Adric feel like a character you would enjoy, but it also feels like this should have been the cliffhanger and not the actual cliffhanger was kind of weak by comparison. It's not a cliffhanger that you think should be done. I will also say, this is a story actually directed by Barnaby Edwards. So you actually get so after basically a bunch of most of the Tom Baker audios having that same style of being directed, of Nicholas Briggs' direction, the way Barnaby Edwards directs his actors is marked differently. It's kind of a breath of fresh air, and is actually it's a lot of fun to see. Just to see how someone else would direct these characters and direct this story. He does a good job of really doing doing some it's just some fun stuff with the characters, and really sort of emphasizing sort of the very sci-fi 80s elements, whereas Nick Briggs was more sort of doing this classic 70s stuff. It's very much fitting within the era. So overall, Starman Part 1 is a decent start to the story. It's got its problems, but it's fun. So overall, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Alright, it's the 10th of November 2019, and I just finished listening to Part 2 of The Starmen. Now, Part 2 of The Starmen is just as good as Part 1, and it's the one where we actually get to see quite a lot of the Starmen. Now, we shifted from sort of doing Ambassadors of Death almost to doing a Fury from the Deep homage, kind of, with this idea of this red coral sort of, basically cascading out, and causing a bunch of problems, for our characters. And I think it's really interesting to note just how much of the story is built up around this red coral, and it's really it is quite an interesting sort of plot device, because you have the Doctor and Tegan sent basically to explore the Johannes Kepler, being the ones like, okay, we're gonna try to figure out what this is and what's going on, and it's gonna be great, which I think is genuinely interesting and an interesting way of doing the story. It does tell a story. It moves things along nicely, and is of course excellent, excellently done. Where you get the you get this nice bit of interaction, and it's nice that it's Tegan, so you have kind of the less, you don't have the scientifically minded character being the one helping with the Doctor. You have the sort of the realist, the one living her life as a just as a real life person, and being pretty down to earth, and with these types of things, which I just think is an excellent way of really getting the story told and making it interesting, because there could have been a lot here that didn't necessarily work out like that, and things weren't really put together at their best, but you have a story like this where there is a good sense of things moving forward, and characters developing. I'd also say that you have two alien factions. You have the titular starmen, who are sort of made out of stars, and they end up rising the dead in what is some genuinely creepy stuff here. Like you have the dead crew members being killed by this coral, rising and almost being taken over, almost like it's some sort of a fungus. And it's very much, the tone of the story is very much one of just sort of, it's very methodical. It's very much characters using science and the scientific method to try and figure out what's going on. This isn't a story where it's you have it's much more on the sort of the idea of a real scientific investigation is occurring here, and not some crazy and over the top big investigation. It's something completely different, which is really good for the story itself. I really did enjoy how the story works as a whole, and kind of just how everything's in the story fits in together, and nicely kind of lines up with things. You have the characters. You have the characters really doing doing the full quite a lot of the story, sort of trying to give you a total ending for the story, and it is good. It is definitely it's definitely an interesting take on the story, as the characters really do interact with each other, and you have the two sort of races, and this bit of the humans being really, really suspicious of these two races, obviously for genuinely good reasons, because they are still technically, this is technically a this is a type of story that you get, where you get the idea of the just sort of the fear between new discoveries and new forms of life as things sort of go together. It's definitely an interesting it's definitely an interesting sort of way of doing the story, and definitely just something that Andrew Smith does a good job on elaborating upon. There's a lot here really to enjoy. Andrew Smith is clearly having a good time letting these characters interact with one another. I will say that it's not necessarily the best one. You know, it's probably about the same level of enjoyment I had with the first episode, but there is a lot here really that you really do that really is solid, and you can really tell Andrew Smith was trying a lot of fun stuff with this story, and this opener. So overall, I am going to give The Starman Part 2 another 7 out of 10. Alright, it's the 10th of November 2019, and I just finished listening to Part 3 of The Starman. Now, I think Part 3 of The Starman is actually the best episode of this story so far. Now, what I mean by that is that it is... Okay, well, what it seems that Andrew Smith has been doing for each episode is basically been kind of tackling a different genre of story each time. Like, the characters end up doing something sort of totally different each time, and they have, a bunch of sort of different things going on, sort of based on where the story is moving. Like, at the end of the last episode, Tegan had basically been captured with, like, this one guy who's also captured by who was a slave to the Starmen, and basically she's, trying kind of to save him, and trying to get him, they're trying to find a way out, and this is the episode where we kind of get the backstory of the Starmen. So we actually have Tegan and this guy jump into a different universe through a portal, and they get trapped there. Sort of playing with, the idea of, just the idea of having a different universe is interesting enough. But there's just that interesting sort of aspect of the story where you have these characters being basically having a bunch of different things going on, and having this, this sort of whole different universe scenario play out with them. It's genuinely quite a fascinating aspect to the story, and Andrew Smith does a good job of sort of making this universe feel different. And of course there are references to E-Space to make it feel like there's that sense of sort of continuity here with the very different with the very different sort of with the very different way that this story is going. The characters find themselves in just these different solutions, and it's genuinely an interesting way of doing this story, that you get this real sense of character growth and stuff going on. And I think Tegan really does shine here, but there is also these there's also these great ideas of just the characters, and this whole different universe aspect of the plot just builds up an interesting way of doing the story. It's something that I think that the characters get a solid understanding of, and generally just a solid sort of just a solid way, of doing this story because of it. It's most definitely one of those stories where you really do get the sense that the characters, that the characters have an idea of where things are going. Now, I'll also say Andrew Smith does an excellent job at giving the Starmen a backstory. Obviously, they're from the different universe, but they need the idea is that they need a specific metal, basically to be, to sort of enter our universe, and in entering our universe, they kind of keep needing this metal, and they've run their own universe dry. That's why they're coming to our universe, which I just think is a fascinating idea for the characters, is just having them, come here, basically trying to find a way to survive in sort of this harsher living environment of our universe. And it's really interesting because you have the Doctor sort of put at the mercy of these creatures throughout this story, because throughout this specific episode, just because he's dragged to their universe, and now you have Tegan sort of having this also just different, this very much a different sort of plot line as the characters try to find their own ending, and try to find just the complete, just this complete nature to the story, having the story build up to something something like this is I think something really I think it's something really solid, and something that the story does a good job of filling out. It really is. It is something, and I think actually Adric and Nyssa have something really good, because Adric has to kind of figure out what's going on, and there's nice character interactions throughout, where you have this character called Autumn, who's been in the entire story. I mentioned her in part 1, and she sort of has this little sort of pseudo romance with Adric throughout the story, basically showcasing what their relationship can be, and where their relationship is sort of going for the time being. It's really going towards this whole idea of having the characters give what is a really what is a really interesting arc, and a bit where Adric kind of just has to come to terms, and basically he's got to live through the idea that that he's that he is that he is a character the character who has perhaps the most to lose. And I think that is interesting. They have this weird romance, while Adric is also having to dispel the Starmen who are trying to get into his mind and take him over as well. It's really interesting. Now, my one thing is that I think Smith doesn't do the best job to deal with this, because he still kind of falls into that crowded TARDIS minute team. But overall, the Starman Part 3 is is the most enjoyable episode thus far, so I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Alright, it is the 11th of November 2019, and I just finished listening to Part 4 of The Starmen. Now, Part 4 of The Starmen it's an interesting conclusion, mainly because as a conclusion to the story, this is one where you really don't get the best sense that of like this actually concluding in any interesting way. A lot of this story is sort of done. It is basically done with, it was done sort of finishing a story. Finishing a story in perhaps the most standard way. It's most definitely a good end to an episode. I won't deny that. It is a good ending story. The story does end in at least a satisfactory way. It's it's interesting enough that you have the characters really making all of the difference, for the story, and playing different actions and playing with a lot of stuff. Like the story ends nicely with a solid ending, and a solid sort of just story idea. It's definitely interesting. Now, what I will say about the story is that the story itself, we not only finish on a high, but we finish on perhaps one of the highest. That Andrew Smith does manage to make you feel bad for a character who dies. You have the character of Autumn, who basically fell in love with Adric over the course of this story, and they have this little side romance that Adric doesn't entirely reciprocate, and it's kind of awkward, but I think it's kind of meant to be awkward. Which is it's a sweet romance and a sweet aspect to the story, but I will say that it's the kind of plot that you expect the story to do. This is, it's like you expect that this character isn't going to make it out alive because of how much they're like, oh, Adric and this girl seem to be hitting it off. I wonder how that's going to end. And surprise, surprise, it ends poorly. You have the story kind of built around you have the story built around the idea of things going places, but it doesn't quite work well, or at least as well as everything kind of does, does a lot of stuff. It is an interesting enough sort of story that you get things done, and I will be honest, the ending of the story does at least play with some fun stuff with the with who the with what the villains are and how they're defeated, very much being like turning them into the coral then into gas, and sort of having this idea of them really being a danger from another universe. That is definitely interesting, but it's not really a it's not really it's not really a perfect conclusion, and I will say it does kind of leave things up interesting. It could be an interesting note for the character of Adric to see where the rest of the trilogy explores, but that doesn't mean a lot of stuff happens. You know, it's one of those. It's a very interesting story that way, and you know it is kind of telling that that's where the story ends, and it's a very solid ending. So overall, I'm going to give the Starman Part 4 7 out of 10. That being said, we added the scores and averaged them out to give the Starman a final score of 7.25 out of 10. Thank you everybody for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. As always, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. And join me next time when I take a look at the second part of this trilogy, of this first trilogy of Doctor Who story, of Fifth Doctor audios with the Contingency Club.